Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on science-based targets. My name is Kenneth, I'm one of the co-founders of Carbon+Alt+Delete, and I'm happy to host so many of you. It shows that science-based targets is a topic of interest. So in the coming hour, we hope to learn some new things on science-based targets. Before we dive into the content, three housekeeping rules. We have a kind of a big audience today, so by default you're muted. By default your camera is switched off and you cannot unmute yourself. You cannot switch on your camera. Our apologies for that, but we ask you to still nevertheless interact and use the chat for that. So feel free to already introduce yourself during the webinar. If you have questions, remarks, put them in the chat. We do have a Q&A at the end, but we also keep an eye on the chat during the webinar itself to address questions as they come in. So today I brought a colleague of mine, Steven. He's one of our carbon experts, so that means he's basically, together with some other people in his team, responsible to keep Carbon+Alt+Delete compliance in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the ISO standard, but also with new guidances and regulations, CSRD, science-based targets. You also see Javi. He's also part of the Carbon+Alt+Delete team on the business development side, and he's here to help a bit with the logistics, follow up on questions as well. Before we dive into the content on science-based targets, allow me to say 2 words on Carbon+Alt+Delete itself. I guess the majority of the people in the call know a bit who we are and what we do, but for the others, it also never hurts to get a recap. We are a carbon accounting software provider. So we're a software company. We build software to calculate corporate carbon footprints. And the way that we work is we work exclusively together with carbon accountants or sustainability consultants who use our software to serve their clients. And their clients are typically medium-sized companies going from around 10 million turnover in euros, dollars, British pound, up to around 1 billion. So companies that are big enough to do a proper reporting, but not big enough to do it fully internally. So they need to rely on experts, consultants, carbon accountants, like I think the majority of the people here in the call. And those people need then software like us to do things quicker and more standardized in the back. Our platform itself, we focus on the full process from doing a corporate carbon footprint, going from data collection down to compliant reporting. Our platform is also verified, so we help consultants in every step of the process. So that's one word on what we do. If you still have questions on that, feel free to reach out. But the topic of today is science-based targets. And by working with a lot of sustainability consultants across topics, we learned that science-based targets is an increasingly important topic. So today I will give the floor to Steven in 2 minutes. He will give a quick introduction, give a crash course on how to do science-based targets and what's behind it. And third, give a quick demo on how we, Carbon+Alt+Delete, can help you with calculating and setting science-based targets for companies. We have a Q&A slot at the end, but as said, feel free to already put questions in the chat as we go. So why we believe as a company, as Carbon+Alt+Delete, in the value of science-based targets, basically for three reasons. One, it really entails an obligation of effort for companies, right? So companies who subscribe or set a science-based target basically have this obligation of effort. It's not an obligation of result, right? So it's not that if you don't meet your target, you get punished, but the obligation of effort is important. And also, and that's, I think, very important personally, if you ask me, it entails a commitment to be transparent. If you as a company set a science-based target, you basically commit to be transparent on your climate impact in the base year, but also on every recurring year. And that's, I think, the third point. Setting a science-based target is not a one-off exercise. It's basically the start of a journey where on a recurring and sustained way as a company, you're going to track your climate impact and you're going to do efforts to reduce it. So I think these are three very important things that make us a big fan or believer of science-based targets. We're a bit more skeptical towards carbon neutral labels, but that's another discussion where those three things are a little bit less covered. But therefore, we believe strongly in the value of science-based targets, and we also see that more and more companies that do their carbon footprint on Carbon+Alt+Delete start to set science-based targets. So before handing the floor to Steven, I would like to start with a quick question just to get a bit of an idea on who's in the call. So please, if you go to menti.com and you enter this code, you will see the question on how many companies you have already helped with setting science-based targets. Please do so. I see some answers coming in. Very good. So that means it works. Still, I give you a couple of seconds. Give some answers. Let me already spoil you. So we have 50 answers in for now. Still answers coming in. Good. I think Steven, this is useful, right? So we see that for the majority, let's say the majority of the users have no experience or a bit with one company, and we have around 1/4 of experienced users doing it for several companies. And in particular, the people that have done it for more than 20 companies, I would invite them to basically help us answering questions in the chat and share their learnings and experience. Let me go back to the slides here. Steven, I think you will take over the screen now, right?
Yes.
Very good. Let me stop sharing.
So let me then indeed go.
And while you're sharing the screen, I forgot to mention, but we will share the recordings and the slides afterwards. So you can take notes, but you can make your life easier. We'll share it afterwards.
Yeah, I also answered the question of Debbie, I think, in the chat. So that applies, of course, to all of you. No, very interesting. Thanks for answering the poll. It's nice to get an insight that, let's say, the majority of you are still quite new or not, let's say, fully experienced in doing target setting calculations and all aspects related to for your clients. First, some slides on the Science-Based Target Initiative. So the Science-Based Target Initiative drives ambition on climate action in the private sector. So it's only for companies, not for let's say governments, to set science-based emission reduction targets. So it was initiated in 2015, really to comply companies with the trajectory that governments were setting within the Paris Agreement. So that was the initial idea. And actually the initiators or the initiative was done by some of that you will know, the CDP, UN, the WRA or I, and the WWF, also organizations involved in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And for me, the SBTi or the Science Based Targets Initiative is really like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol of target setting. It's the standard. It's the standard of target setting as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is of accounting. Maybe just a quite evident one, but not therefore not less important to stress, is that the SBTi is just an initiative. It's a standard framework, but it's not a legislation or a local translated legislation. You will see, and we come back to that later, for example, in the relation to the ESRS, that of course a translation of the science-based targets still needs to be put in local legislation. The Science-Based Target Initiative provides a 5-step process to which you come with your SBTi approval label for the targets you have set. You have the commitment. So first you start as an organization committing that you want to set a target, then you develop your target and you need to submit it the latest 2 years after your commitment. Then of course you need to communicate. You have some some degrees of freedom how to communicate, and then of course logically you need to disclose on your progress of your targets. Today the majority of our attention will go to the second step, to the development step. Today won't be really going into detail in the other four, let's say, more administrative steps. Before we go into more aspects on more, let's say, content aspects of the SBTi, I think it's a nice one to keep in mind what the size of the SBTi is. At the moment, more than 4,500 companies have set their science-based targets and are taking action, or are committing. More than 7,000 are committing to take actions, and a bit less than 3,000, let's say 2/3, and also commit to net zero to 2050. Also important for you to know is that the SBTi is really feeling the momentum, feeling the sense that it gains momentum, and is really stepping up its capacity to keep up with all validation steps. You can find more information on their recent posts on their website, but it can be an important one to keep in mind that they're aware of their momentum and their increasing capacity. Before we go into the scientific basis and the crash course on SBTi, when I was addressing the fact that for me SBTi is really like the greenhouse gas protocol of what the greenhouse gas protocol is for carbon accounting, SBTi is for target setting. You see that too in the translation of science-based target, not specifically the SBTi, but all the basis of science-based targets in your European Sustainability Reporting Standards, the E14 on mitigation targets, and also the referral in the ISO Net Zero guidelines to the SBTi. And it's not vice versa that SBTi is referring to these two. So for me, it's really like the standard of target setting. All right, more into content. Scientific basis of the SBTi. So what SBTi does, or their main task, is really to provide companies with scenarios, with targets that they know are compliant with the science basis, the 1.5 degrees Celsius maximum increase. SBTi bases itself on the integrated assessment models of the IPCC, does a subset of scenarios of that integrated assessment models based on some plausibility criteria, responsibility criteria, feasibility criteria, and then comes up actually with a scenario, with a target scenario for both on a near term and the long term. Their general steps that they follow is that they first assess logically a certain carbon budget that can be addressed, whether it's cross-sectional or in a section. They assign a certain emission scenario to it, so a way of distributing that carbon budget, total carbon budget over time, to different time steps. And then, and I come back to that later on, really think about how to allocate that carbon budget over time to the companies within sectors and also between sectors. So that's the real, I think that's also the real added value, or one of the major added values of SBTi is their thoroughness, their scientific basis of their target setting. And also, if you're interested more in these foundations, these scientific basis, SBTi published already in 2019 their foundation, their scientific foundation on how they calculate their targets. So it might be an interesting one to check if you really want to understand the scientific basis of it. All right, let's then move to the crash course. I tried to set up my own five-step calculation process rather, to come up with a target. But before we dive into that, we want you to join us in the conversation and address a question that you struggle the most in the science-based target or science-based target initiative process. It's the same code in Menti, but it's the second question.
Yes, and I see
And
answers
then
coming in, so it should work.
I will stop sharing my screen so you can quickly shorten it.
Yes, absolutely. Let me wait a couple of seconds. I don't want to influence people while they're answering. So the options that we have is I don't struggle, the process is a struggle, calculating is a struggle, sector-specific targets, intensity targets, or stakeholder management. It should be a multi-response question. I don't know whether that's the correct term, but you can give multiple answers, and it seemed like the main struggle is with just calculating the targets in general. And then you see there is a quarter of the group also interested or looking or struggling or having some questions on sector-specific targets. Stakeholder management is very broad, so I'm also interested on purpose. We've put it here very broad. So the people who answered here, if they want to specify what exactly they're struggling with on stakeholder management, please feel free to put that in the chat. It's something we will address not in detail in the rest of the slides. We'll focus more on the targets itself, so in line with the red and the orange block, but nevertheless interested to learn from that and exchange on stakeholder management as well. So with that, Steven, I give the screen back to you, and then you can continue with the content.
Yes. Let me share my screen again. So I really like the response, so that confirms the perspective we wanted to put in this webinar. So that's really nice. So first step in that crash course 5-step process is actually determining your baseline, really thinking about your starting point, which emissions to start from to start calculating my target. And there, in that determination or that assessment of your base year emissions on which you start calculating your target reductions, we see a really strict alignment with the greenhouse gas protocol again. Quite logically, as I addressed earlier, due to the involvement of quite the same or similar organizations. We also see quite important step, and I think that's the same for your accounting base year, that you set your organizational boundary right, and you align it. If you set a target base here, that you align it really with your general accounting organizational boundary. Second is that you also make a choice in your target setting. You can choose whether to address it or approach it on a market or location-based one, that you also assess which is most suitable for you and that you continue in a consistent way. Thirdly, scope 3, there are some optional emissions, also quite related to the minimal boundaries of your greenhouse gas protocol for scope 3 and your required or your optional boundaries rather. And a fourth point is really an important one. When you set your base year emissions, you cannot include any offsets or avoided emissions in these in that base year. So if you would have or offsets out of your outside of your supply chain, you cannot subtract them from your emissions to actually even in your base year, but also later on when setting your targets. That's really beyond scope of the SBTi. The SBTi really focuses on your actual emissions and only for FLAG, the FLAG SBTi, so the forest, land and agricultural guidance, or sector, just in general, the agricultural and land sector. And for us there, you have the possibility, again, in line with the greenhouse gas protocol, land sector and removal guidance, to take into account your removals. Why is all of this so important? To set us a right target base year, to set a right base year, is really to avoid target recalculation. SBTi sets, and I think it makes much sense, sets to force you or to engage you to renew your targets every 5 years. But if, for example, your business activities change dramatically within these 5 years due to mergers or acquisitions or whatever, big business change, structural change, errors you have done in your initial base year calculations, you need to recalculate your target. Due to the fact that it's a quite elaborate process and also a process that comes with a cost, we advise you really to think thoroughly about setting your base year straight, your boundaries straight, and to avoid target recalculation in the future. I think in general, that's to be fully transparent, that's something that by first digging in the SBTi, I underestimated the importance of setting a straight base year, but by getting more and more practical experience, that's really one of the key moments, key facts of setting a good target is to really set your base year boundaries straight. And that really aligns with the two questions I addressed that I think are probably frequently asked questions or will be frequently asked questions in the near future. And it's really about if I set a target and I have my base year and I know that my business activities will change, I should really already think on that when setting my base year straight. If I know that I have a changing business, I might try to advocate to exclude certain emissions that are not representative for my future, or to anticipate on certain changes by selecting an appropriate representative base year. So that's really an important step already there. And then last, I think also a logical question, depending on your target calculation method on which I come later, it's really important to try to optimize and to try to valorize the actions you have already taken in your base year. And therefore, the SBTi really gave a lot of freedom, I think, to be able to set your base year up until 2015, so go back already 8 years in the past, to have to be able to actually assess your previous actions rather in your base year assessment. And that really comes, I think, in general, finding that tipping point, finding that sweet spot. Javi and Kenneth, can you just give a thumbs up that everybody can see my mouse? Okay, perfect. So that's really the difference between base year, submission year, is finding that sweet spot of your top of your emissions to be able to calculate your reduction that you have put from your top to your eventual target year properly. Another aspect which is quite important to take into account in your base year boundaries is the coverage. So every SBTi, apart from your the emissions that you can leave out because they're not, or your excluded emissions because they're not significant or not representative, the calculation of your targets can be limited to coverage for scope 1 and 2 to 95%, and for scope 3 for the near term to 67%, and for your long term to 2050 to 90%. Just take into account, you don't need to remember for now these numbers, but take into account that your coverage, good to calculate your eventual targets, can differ from scope and can differ from near or long-term targets. Sorry,
Stephen, can I jump here? Because there was a question from Emily exactly on this point. So she basically asked, so indeed for scope 1 and 2, 95% coverage. Does this mean that you can exclude 5%? And then the same, same question for scope 3. So how to understand this 5% or 33% that you can exclude?
Yes, so it's basically, it means that the coverage, if your total emissions for scope 1 and 2 are 1,000, that means that you calculate your target based on 950, and that actually that 50 stays constant, so it doesn't need to be reduced. That's the, I don't know whether that example was clear, but that's really like how you should understand the coverage. So it's really like subtracting a certain amount of emissions from your base year that you want to reduce, and that will stay constant. I think it, to maybe link it to our previous webinar, it really makes sense, for example, if you have 4% spend-based emissions calculated, you know I can't reduce them really, that you take these spend-based emissions in your 5% that you won't cover in your target, as it doesn't make really sense to be able to reduce these emissions.
There was a follow-up from Emily that it doesn't mean that you can exclude some non-significant emissions. But I think that links more to your basic carbon footprint, right? Where in the greenhouse gas protocol, you have rules on what you need to include in your carbon footprint, and whether process emissions are relevant if you have one very tiny emissions from process emissions. But that's more on the greenhouse gas protocol, Emily. But once you've calculated your carbon footprint based on all relevant activity categories according to the greenhouse gas protocol, then you move to the target setting, and then this 95% coverage applies to your target setting. Is that correct, Steven?
Yeah, indeed. There are two levels of exclusion. So the first level of exclusion is indeed, should I take it into account in my greenhouse gas emission balance? That's the first one. And then a second level of exclusion is really linked to, okay, this is my greenhouse gas emission balance, my accounting balance, and I can exclude certain emissions to set my target. Actually, basically, I can exclude certain emissions from reducing them. So some can stay constant. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the question. I hope that clarified for some of you some aspects. Step number 2 of the crash course is set your target boundary straight. And that's really, I think there are 4 elements to take into account, but let me first explain this graph. I think it's really, also from the SBTi, really comprehensive graph on target setting. So there are targets on near term, 5 to 10 years, and there are targets on long term, really aligning with your net zero by 2050. The SBTi provides a near-term target setting framework, and if you want to go further, you can also add to that near-term target a long-term target and a net zero plan, and that the net zero plan also has removals to it to really succeed in having that net zero. Another important aspect, but will be not like the full scope. I will explain it in the demo a bit, but the SBTi also made the effort to make a distinction between what should be the targets for SMEs and what should be the targets for non-SMEs, or let's say just regular large companies. The SMEs is a very simplified approach to set your targets and your target boundaries. So I will today focus more on the non-SME aspect, but I will show it during the demo how you can use or how you can apply your company size in our app. And then last important point is that the SBTi, it's an important one to keep into account, that the SBTi also gives the freedom to account for a single target, a single, let's say, single target for scope 1, 2, and 3 together, or with multiple targets even between scopes or intra-scope. And I will also address that shortly, how we tackled that in our tool. First question, important question, I think, that could become or is already a frequently asked question. Can I take the long-term target alone? There is the answer no. So it's always first tackling near-term target, and then we go net zero it's involving a near-term target, a long-term target, and some remaining removals. And then how to take into account your coverage. That's again, it was addressed then already by the previous slide, but again, in this target calculation, you start from a base here with a certain reduction of emissions, and then you come up with a certain target boundary based on that coverage you've set in your base here. Okay. So at this moment, we have set base year boundary, target boundary. We selected the target year. We selected a near-term or net zero or long-term frame or target type. Let's now dig into all different types of calculation methods. And it's, I think there are 4, if I can summarize it in 4 ground rules, what type of targets you can encounter in the SBTi is that you can have an absolute reduction method in a percentage reduction from your base year, whether it's on an absolute total greenhouse gas emissions basis or whether it's on an intensity basis. These are mostly the cross-sectional. And then you have an intensity convergence method, basically saying, okay, fine, you can have whatever emission intensity at your base year, but by your target year, you need to have this intensity. For example, if I have a company that has some cement activities, my initial intensity per tons of cement is 5 tons of CO2. I need to have an intensity by 2050 of 1. It doesn't matter whether I started with 5, I started with 4, or I started with 3. It will always be 1 that I need to target in the end. Whereas for the contraction, the absolute reduction method, that's always just in percentages of reduction. And so you will see that the contraction is then not really going to the same endpoint, whereas the conversions is going to the same endpoint. Mostly the contraction is a cross-sectional one rather, and a convergence is the sectional one. What is also important, apart from the distinction between these 2 methods, is that SBTi does not allow you to set targets as an absolute reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So my target will never be, okay, I reduce my emissions with 10,000 tons of CO2. It will always be addressed as a percentage reduction leading to an eventual target, whether it's an absolute emission target or an intensity target, or with the intensity conversion, but never a reduction, an absolute reduction. For example, I start with 1,000 tons CO2, I need to end with 300, or I want to end with 300 tons of CO2. It's not possible to apply for a reduction of 700 tons of CO2 equivalent within the SBTi framework. Then it will always be like the 300 tons of CO2 equivalent that will be the target, or the percentage reduction being 70% in that case. What is also not possible is that you set actually a target as a benchmark performance against sector average values. So you never will be able to set, okay, I want to be in the top 10% of my sector, or I want to do 20% better than my average sector. In the end, that's actually also really refers to that conversions, that in the end, all just need to go as a minimal level to the same eventual intensity. So that's for the ground rules. The SBTi also took the effort to elaborate on both sector-specific targets and non-sector specific. In this slide, I want to quickly show you some insights on the sector-specific one. So in general, the SBTi took the effort for the sectors that have a high carbon or greenhouse gas emissions intensity to actually provide certain sectoral intensity targets, which means that for these really specific sectors, you get a certain intensity endpoint. For example, if you, like you can see over here, for power companies, you need to be able to get on the long term in your net zero strategy less than 0.01 kg CO2 per kilowatt hours. It complies with a 97% reduction, and it's mostly for these sector-specific targets, mostly more reduced than your cross-sectional, your absolute reduction emissions, which are in the long term your 90%. In general, just the most important thing to remind is that there are sector-specific targets, both on a near term and on the long term, and that they differ from each other. And apart from the maritime and power sector and the FLAG sector, or the agricultural, forest and land sector, you're free to choose whether you set a cross-sectional absolute reduction target, meaning just a reduction, a certain absolute reduction, 90%, instead of going for a certain sector-specific intensity target in the end of your target here, which is then really translated in a certain value of ton CO2 per physical entity or physical metric of your sector. And it really, when to choose for sector-specific methods, it really depends, I think, on your level of efforts you already put. It can be that if you are already going, or you have already done a lot of actions and you have a high level of a low level of greenhouse gas emissions intensity, it can make more sense that you comply with your intensity metric. Whereas if it's a difficult one to match, it can make more sense to go for a cross-sectional absolute reduction. Just quick overview. The last slide referred to all sector-specific targets that are already available in the SBTi tool. Just so you know, the SBTi also launched some tools of which we based ourselves to incorporate in our software. And just know that the SBTi, as I addressed earlier, really wants to step up the gaining momentum, is that they also engage to finalize these in development specific ones, sector-specific targets by the end of this year. So that's a quite important one. I won't go into detail to all of them, but you will just notice that these are really indeed the most, or in general, the sectors that have the highest greenhouse gas intensity. So that's why they really focused on these sectors. And then just a quick overview of all type of targets. So for scope 1 and 2, you can choose to have your absolute reduction, or you can choose to focus on renewable electricity, a certain reduction or a certain percentage of renewable electricity to 2030, for example, 100% renewable electricity. The sector intensity conversions, the one that I was addressing 2 slides ago. And then the same goes for scope 3, an absolute reduction, just a percentage reduction of your total emissions for scope 3. You have also the sector-specific intensity conversions, one for scope 3, for the moment, mainly for cement. And then you have 3 others. So you have an economic intensity reduction and a physical intensity reduction. Basically, for the near term, 7% of reduction of your economic intensity, your ton CO2 per your monetary metric, and also 7% reduction per year for your physical intensity, ton CO2 per physical unit. With the long term, it's a higher percentage, it's 97 total reduction, but that's going too much in detail. And also very important, for the near term, you have the possibility, so for your 5 to 10 years in the future, you have the possibility, if you have too little information or you lack data on your scope 3 or supplier emissions, you can submit a target based on supplier or customer engagement, which basically is a target that says 80% of my suppliers will engage their activities with the science-based targets, instead of you telling this will really be my absolute reduction, 80% of reduction, or this will be my reduction of my physical intensity from 10 to 2 tons CO2 per euro, or per mega euro, let's say. So that's really like a quick overview. I think it goes too much in depth to tackle all of them down, but I think it covers just different types of target setting methods, calculation methods. Of course, basic question, or the central question is, with an overview like this, always, when do you choose which calculation methods? Easy answer on that one is really depends on your specific situation as a company. But in general, let's say if you have a lot of changing business, also especially in your supply chain, I would go for an intensity reduction one that is probably more flexible, as it's just based on your intensity. If you have a more stable forecast of your business, an absolute reduction one could be in play. And then, of course, the sector specific, the intensity, that's a question I addressed earlier. That really also depends on your specific sector and whether you can comply, or whether that intensity convergence is really in line with what is feasible for your business. So in general, I think, to summarize the target calculation methods, there are a lot of possibilities, but it needs indeed just a good understanding on which to address for which scope and for which company. And then based on that selection of your target calculation method, I can start calculating my targets, basically by setting my target here, for example, 2030, by setting my scopes and my type of target, in this case, a target that is aggregated for scope 1 and 2 and scope 3, the most logic one. If you see the SBTi guidance, the most logic aggregation level. Then based on my target calculation method, I get a certain percentage for both scope and for the target year. And then I apply that reduction percentage to my initial base year greenhouse gas emissions, and I come up with a certain target intensity, carbon emissions level, in this case an absolute one, as I apply to cross-sectional one in our tool for both scope 1 and 2 and for scope 3, and that adds up to a total target. So that's really when you have calculated your actual reduction percentage based on your the calculation and your choice of target calculation method, then it's really just a simply calculation from your base year to your target year greenhouse gas emissions. And then finally, a step that I will also address in the demo, of course, always important, you choose for a certain target calculation method. So you calculate your targets, and then you need to address them, of course, and compare them to the actions you've set. I think target setting and actions and simulation really are in the interplay and the interface of each other in the eventual estimated emissions in the future. From your actions, you start bottom up. You think about the reduction in emissions based on your greening or electrifying your fleet, greening or making more renewable of your electricity or energy supply. You end up with a certain emission intensity, or just the general emissions, total emissions in year X. Then you have calculated a certain target based on the choice of target calculation method, and then you start comparing and you see, how should I adapt my actions to be able to comply with these targets, or should I check for another target calculation method if it isn't feasible based on the actions I have put. All right, that's so far the crash course. Kenneth, while I'm opening the app. If there are any urgent questions on the matters I've tackled, feel free to address them already. Otherwise, I just continue and I...
Yeah, continue with the demo, Steven. I don't think we need the 10 minutes for the demo. We can do it in a couple of minutes so that we still have a bit of time for the questions.
Yes, indeed, completely agree. Yes. Is that clearly visible?
Yes.
All right, so I'm in the app. I hope most of you, of our current users, will recognize that one. And so with one of the last releases or most recent releases, we added the tab target to our tool. And if I go to target, I already set a target earlier. First step I need to do is to click on to open the detail pane and to really set my target calculation criteria. Before I want to start, if I want more information, we also added a link to our support page where we give a brief explanation on the 5-step processes of which I started with in the beginning of this webinar from the SBTi, and also a dedicated page on how to calculate it and how to do it in our app. So just so you know, the support page is there to help you. And then we actually based ourselves on the absolute contraction, so cross-sectional calculation methods, and we give you the possibility to quite easily and quite swiftly calculate the first target based on the selection of your company size, whether you are an SME or non-SME. I didn't elaborate on that one during this webinar, but just remember, as I told before, the SME is a more simplified approach, and we just incorporated the SME simplified approach in our tool to be able for you to have a quick calculation for your SME. Then you select whether you want a near-term or a long-term target. Long-term target as part of your net zero strategy. You select your base year. Basically, we select the greenhouse gas emissions of that reporting period to calculate our targets on. And then finally, you select a target year based on your selection of your company size. For the SME, in this case, it will be 2030. If I did my selection, it will automatically calculate my emissions, and I will get the breakdown as I explained to you in the calculation slide for scope 1 and 2, for scope 3, and that adds up to a total target. There, at that moment, we have done our calculation. Now, as I showed in my step 5 of my crash course, I want to compare it to my simulated action, and then I go to my simulation, the graph of my simulation, and then I can show my targets with this little button. I can hide it or can show it. I get an overview of my base year, my target year, my target scope 1 and 2, my target scope 3, my target total, as I had in my previous view in the target setting, and I can start comparing my actual targets with the action I addressed and the subsequent greenhouse gas emissions. In this case, my target, for example, in 2030 is below my greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 based on my actions. So that means that I should address my actions to lower that greenhouse gas emissions to be able to be compliant with my targets. And this way you can actually go back to your simulation, do your actions again, and compare it again to your targets. And that's really the flow of calculating a target, comparing it with your actions that we wanted to trigger. So far, so good. So I think that's giving the time where I will stop the demo.
Yes, thanks a lot, Steven. In the meantime, we got quite a bit of questions.
Yes.
We also already answered some, or people helped us answering some over the chat. Maybe one question, Steven, was on this slide on the different types of targets that you have, and to what extent you can combine them, in particular for scope 3. So for instance, to set an absolute reduction for part of your scope 3 and then a supplier target for another part of your scope 3. I don't know whether you can comment on that.
Yeah, for sure. As I understand the SBTi, that is possible. So you can have also different intra-scope, for example, intra-scope 3 emission targets with different calculation methods. So sometimes it makes sense, I think, if you know, for example, for 80% of my emissions of scope 3, I know the emissions actually, but for 20% it's less clear, it's more difficult to follow up that I have for that 80% a certain reduction, whether it's an absolute reduction or on intensity basis, and then the remaining 20% are supplier engagement or customer engagement. Yeah.
And then a link to that, I'm reading some question is on the intensity convergence or sector-specific metrics. To what extent are you free to define which intensity you use per euro turnover, per output, or is that also set by the sector-specific standards?
The sector-specific are very much set. So it's really, for example, for cement, it's in tons of cement produced. For residential or service buildings, it's in square meter. For power, it's in megawatt hours. So that's really fixed. And that also is much more fixed than the economic intensity or physical intensity reduction that are cross-sectional. That's really try to set up the good physical unit you want to calculate your intensity with. And same goes for the economic intensity. So that's really difference, I think, with the intensity convergence. And also, again, big difference with sector-specific intensity convergence and a cross-section economic or physical intensity is the sector-specific has an endpoint, an intensity endpoint that is the same for all that use that sector-specific one. For a cross-section one, that's really a reduction percentage in the near term, that's 7%, both for economic and physical one. And so you can end up with a different eventual intensity, which you will not have with your sector-specific.
Okay. Then maybe two other things. There were a bunch of questions on basically this slide and exactly how to deal with the 95 and 33% or 67. But what I would propose is that we come back to that offline after. There were a bunch of them. I think it makes sense for us to group them and give you one complete answer. Final question before we start to wrap up, to be respectful of everyone's time, is on flag. Emissions. You know, Steven, I asked you internally already, how comes that you can set a flag science-based target, but you don't have the LSRG greenhouse gas protocol ready? So I don't know, high level, whether you can comment a bit on that. How would you today advise companies to go about flag emissions and setting a flag science-based target?
Yeah, so basically what the SBTi did was indeed the land sector removal guidance, let's say all agricultural, forest and land use aspects of carbon accounting is still in draft version and will only be completed by the end of this year probably. But the SBTi took a leap and actually said, okay, but you're already obliged to set targets for your forest, land and agricultural activities, even though the LSRG is still draft version, you need to base yourself on that draft version. What the flag emissions, or when you are obliged to use the flag reduction targets, is really based on your land sector emissions intensity. If you go beyond the 20% of your total emissions based on flag emissions, then you need to do it. Or when you are in the typical sectors, and the typical sectors are certain paper, certain dairy, certain meat sectors, really like the typical agriculture and forestry related sectors. So that's really like the two criteria. How to deal with it? Basically, it's using the flag guidance and trying to use the draft version of the LSRG at this moment to the best of your capacity to set your flag target. And then waiting for the land sector and removal guidance to publish its final version and see whether that differs much. I must say that I expect the land sector and removal guidance not to change that dramatically. So the general subdivision on land use change emissions, land management emissions removal, I expect that to be the same, and some general ground rules how to calculate or account for them. But it's then really about the fine tuning that can have an impact. So that's, yeah, in general, my response. I think it's a hard one that they made it obligatory, but it's the context we're in now.
Thanks, Steven. There are quite a bit of other questions that we don't have the time to address them. I want to stop in 2 minutes to be respectful of everyone's time, but it links to basically two final announcements that we want to make before we let you go. One is that we are basically, as of today, launching an open community for carbon experts, which is an online forum. I've put a link in the chat. You can scan the screen here. It's basically community.carbon+Alt+Delete.eu, exactly to continue discussion. This is the 4th or 5th webinar that we organize. We have heard from you requests to basically have a forum to exchange with each other. We moderate it a bit, but it's also the goal that you share your learnings, ask your questions, answer questions as you go. We know that if you ask questions to science-based targets or the greenhouse gas protocol, they typically don't answer. They're a bit under the water. So we hope to fill part of that gap with this community. So I would advise you or invite you to go to the site, maybe add it to your bookmarks and have a look at it once in a while, or when you need help, put a question there. We will also put the answers to our questions in this community, right? So that you will follow it there. And then the final thing I want to say before I let you go is basically an invitation for our next webinar. I don't know, Steven, whether you can put the link in the chat. So as you know, basically every 2 months we organize a webinar on a specific topic related to carbon accounting. The next one will focus on uncertainty and how to quantify uncertainty in carbon accounting. It's also functionality that we are developing within Carbon+Alt+Delete. And that will be mid of April, same time slot as today. So you're already invited to register for that one, if that might be of interest to you. And that brings us to the end of the webinar. Thanks a lot for joining. I hope you learned something from it. If you have other questions for us, if you want to know more about our product, feel free to reach out. But then I wish you a very nice and pleasant continuation of the day. Thanks you for joining, and talk to you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you.